guys. So in today's video we'll be looking at the chapter framing the constitution and beginning of a new era. Okay, so in this chapter we'll be looking at the history that lies behind the constitution and the intense debates that were part of its making. If we try and hear the voices within the Constituent Assembly, we get an idea about the process through which the constitution was framed and the vision of the new nation formulated. So we'll be looking into it first. Initially we'll be looking into the background in which the Constituent Assembly was formed. What was the political and social condition at that time? Okay, so one striking feature was that when the Quit India movement started, when the non-cooperation movement started, there were no differences of religion existing among the people. Hindu and Muslim community unitedly they protested against the oppression from the British. Okay, in contrast, although the people were united, the Congress and the Muslim League they could not come to an agreement about the League was demanding a separate country or separate state, but Congress wanted everyone to stay within the same territory. Okay, and there were riots going on in the area between Hindus and Muslims after the independence, and many people were dying on both sides. We have seen this in the previous chapter on partition. I have explained it clearly on the previous chapter of partition, so look into it. So the violence culminated in the massacres and accompanied the transfer of populations when the partition of India was announced. On Independence Day, 15th August 1947, there was an outburst of joy and hope, unforgettable for those who lived through that time. But innumerable Muslims in India, Hindus and Sikhs in Pakistan were now faced with a cruel choice: the threat of sudden death or squeezing of opportunities on the one side, and a forcible tearing away from their age-old roots. The Muslims who were in India, vast majority of them, they had to go to Pakistan, and same happened for Sikhs and Hindus in Pakistan. They had to come to India. Millions of refugees were on the move. Muslims into East and West Pakistan, Hindus and Sikh into West Bengal and the eastern half of the Punjab. Many perished before they reached their destination. Another and scarcely less serious problem faced by the new nation was the princely state. The princely state, when the British left, there was no proper arrangement for princely state. They were asked to join, either remain an independent nation or they could join either one of the union, either Pakistan or India. Okay, so approximately 1/3 of the area of the subcontinent was under the control of Nawabs and Maharajas who owned alliance to the British crown, but were otherwise left mostly free to rule or misrule their territory as they wished. Okay, they could do whatever they want in their own territory. Okay, when the British left, the constitutional status of these princes remained ambiguous. There was a confusion. As one contemporary observer remarked, some Maharajas now began to luxuriate in wild dreams of independent power in an India of many partitions. Okay, so this was the background in which the Constituent Assembly met. So how could the debates within the assembly remain insulated from what was happening outside? So the making of the Constituent Assembly. Okay, so we are looking at how the Constituent Assembly was found. So members of the Constituent Assembly were not elected on the basis of universal franchise. Okay, in this provincial elections were held and the provincial legislatures then chose the representatives of the Constituent Assembly. Okay, it was the provincial legislatures who selected the members of the Constituent Assembly. Constituent Assembly that came into being was dominated by one party, the Congress. The Congress swept the general seats in the provincial elections. The Muslim League captured most of the reserved Muslim seats, but the League chose to boycott the Constituent Assembly, pressing its demand for Pakistan with a separate constitution. And socialists were also not willing to join. They believed that Constituent Assembly was a creation of the British and therefore incapable of being truly autonomous. In fact, 82% of the members of the Constituent Assembly were also members of the Congress. So these were some faults, we can say, if the question is asked, What were the drawbacks of Constituent Assembly? You can say all these points. So Congress, however, was not a party. So now we are looking into what kind of Congress or how were the members of the Congress party at that time in the Constituent Assembly. So the Congress, however, was not a party with one voice. Its members differed in their opinion on critical issues. Some members were inspired by socialism, while others were defenders of landlordism. Exactly the opposite. Some were close to communal parties, while others were assertively secular. Through the national movement, Congress members had learned to debate their ideas in public and negotiate their differences. Within the Constituent Assembly, too, Congress members did not sit quiet. So it was through discussions of varying topic for separating or opposing topics. These clashed, and finally, a solution was came. Solution was created, and it was a procedure through which the Constituent Assembly ultimately formed our constitution. The discussions within the Constituent Assembly were also influenced by the opinion expressed by the public. As the deliberations continued, the arguments were reported in newspapers and the proposals were publicly debated. This was a Constituent Assembly session. Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel is seen sitting on the right. Okay. And counter criticism on the press in turn shaped the nature of the constitutions that ultimately reached. Also, the public also participated in creating a proper constant, their opinions were also heard via the press. Okay. And we will see what all demands were there. In order to create a sense of collective participation in the public was also asked to send their views on what was needed to be done. Many of the linguistic minorities, those who were having separate language, wanted the protection of their mother tongue. Religious minorities asked for special safeguards, while Dalits demanded an end to all caste oppression and reservation of seats in government bodies. Important issues of cultural rights and social justice raised in their public discussions were debated on the floor of the assembly. So these kind of demands were risen by the general public. Okay, so now we will see who were the main dominant speakers or dominant members of the Constituent Assembly. So Constituent Assembly had a 300 members. Of these, 6 members played particularly important roles. 3 were representatives of the Congress, namely who? Jawaharlal Nehru, Vallabhbhai Patel, and Rajendra Prasad. So Nehru we have seen as earlier, he was a socialist. It was Nehru who moved the crucial objective resolution. Objective resolution means it is basically the aim. They represented what all objectives had to be done in the constitution. This objective resolution, as well as the resolution for proposing the national flag of India to be a horizontal tricolor of saffron, white, and dark green in equal proportion with a wheel in navy blue at the center. So now we come to Patel. Patel, on the other hand, worked mostly behind the scenes. Okay, he was a major player in bringing all the princely state into the Indian Union. So Patel is a mastermind guy. Okay, playing a key role in the drafting of several reports and working to reconcile opposing points of view. These kind of actions were done by Patel. Now we will look at the role of Rajendra Prasad. So Rajendra Prasad was basically the president of the assembly, where he had to steer the discussion along the constructive lines while making sure all members had a chance to speak. So he made sure that all the members' expressions, their opinions were heard in the assembly. Okay. Besides this Congress trio, a very important member of the assembly was a lawyer and economist, B.R. Ambedkar. Most important person when we are talking about Constituent Assembly. During the period of British rule, Ambedkar had been a political opponent of the Congress. But on the advice of Mahatma Gandhi, he was asked at the independence to join the Union Cabinet as a law minister. So he was a nominated candidate. In this capacity, we can say like that, okay. In this capacity, he served as chairman of the drafting committee of the Constitution. Serving with him were 2 other lawyers, K. M. Munshi from Gujarat and Alladi Krishna Swami Iyer from Madras, both of whom gave crucial inputs in the drafting of the Constitution. So these 6 members, K. M. Munshi, Krishna Swami Iyer, B.R. Ambedkar, Rajendra Prasad, Jawaharlal Nehru, and Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel. These 6 members were given vital assistance by 2 civil servants. One was B.N. Rao, constitutional advisor of the Government of India, who prepared a series of background papers based on the close study of the political systems obtaining in other countries. So B.N. Rao was basically the person who looked into the constitutions of other countries. The other was chief draftsman S.N. Mukherjee, who had the ability to put complex proposals in clear legal languages. So he was a person who we can say that translated the opinions of the members of the Constituent Assembly into legal language. Okay, that was S.N. Mukherjee. Ambedkar himself had the responsibility of guiding the drafting constitution through the assembly. This took 3 years in all. How many years it took for the constitution to be made? 3 years in all, with the printed volume of the discussions taking up 11 bulky volumes. But while the process was long, it was also extremely interesting. The members of the Constituent Assembly were eloquent in expressing their sometimes very divergent points of view. So we'll be looking into different points of view, different crises that arose in the process of making the constitution. Okay. So this is the image of B.R. Ambedkar proceeding over the discussion of Hindu Code Bill. Okay, this is B.R. Ambedkar. So vision of the constitution. So we have said earlier, Jawaharlal Nehru introduced the objective resolution on 13th December 1946 in the Constituent Assembly. It was a momentous resolution that outlined the defining ideals of the Constitution of the independent India and providing the framework within which the work of constitution making was to proceed. So it literally gave us a viewpoint or a aim in which how the constitution should be made. Okay, it proclaimed India as an independent sovereign republic, guaranteed its citizens justice, equality, and freedom, and assured that adequate safeguards would be provided for minorities, backward and tribal areas, depressed and other backward classes. Okay, these were all the inputs that were given in were objective resolutions. Okay, after outlining these objectives, Nehru placed the Indian experiment in a broad historical perspective. Okay, and he made his mind went back to the historic efforts of the past to produce such documents of rights. Basically, what he meant was he was talking about the French Revolution, he was talking about the European reminiscence. All these things were talked by Jawaharlal Nehru. So, those kind of movements were put in focus by Jawaharlal Nehru. So, he was saying that kind of like India was also going through such a transformational change. Okay, now the will of the people, the concerns we can say. A communist member, Somanath Lahiri, saw the dark hand of British imperialism. See, the Constituent Assembly was formed even before 1947, even before independence. Okay, so it was actually a British organization, we can say to some extent. Okay, hanging over the deliberations of the Constituent Assembly. He thus urged the members and the Indians in general to fully free themselves of the influence of the imperial rule. In the winter of 1946 to 1947, as the Assembly deliberated, the British were still in India. An interim administration headed by Jawaharlal Nehru was in place. So, Jawaharlal Nehru, it was a kind of interim government. Okay, but it could not operate. It could only operate under the directions of the Viceroy. Viceroy was still there, and the British government in London. So, Lahiri exhorted his colleagues to realize that the Constituent Assembly was a British made and was working the British plans as the British should like it to be worked out. Okay, so this is the image of members of the interim government. Okay, so just go through the names, even though we will be discussing it in the historical background in Lakshmikant. So just go through the names of the members. So this can be, and also the portfolios they handled. So these are kind of important because UPSC can ask such questions. Okay. Nehru admitted that most nationalist leaders had wanted a different kind of constituent assembly. It was also true in a sense that the British government had a hand in its birth and it had attached certain conditions within which the assembly had to function. But Emphasis Nehru. You must not ignore the source from which this assembly derives its strength. Nehru added. Governments did not come into being by state papers. Governments are, in fact, the expression of the will of the people. We have met here today because of the strength of the people behind us, and we shall go as far as the people, not of any party or group, but the people as a whole. So it was represented, it is a representation of the people, will of the people, shall wish us to go. We should therefore always keep in mind the passions that lie in the hearts of the masses of the Indian people and try to fulfill them. Okay, so it was actually a representation. The Constituent Assembly was a representation of the Indian population. Okay, now defining rights. How were the rights of individual citizens to be defined? Were the oppressed groups have any special rights? What rights should minorities have? Who in fact who could be defined as a minority? So all these questions had to be answered. Okay, as the debate on the floor of the Constituent Assembly unfolded, it was clear that there was no collectively shared answers to any of these questions. So there was no proper answer to these questions. The answers were evolved through clash of opinions and drama of individual encounters. Some people supported it, some people opposed it. That was how it was happening. In his inaugural speech, Nehru had invoked the will of the people and declared that the makers of the constitution had to fulfill the passions that lie in the hearts of the masses. This was no easy task. With the anticipation of independence, different groups expressed their will in different ways and made different demands. This would have to be debated and conflicting ideas would have been reconciled. Therefore, a consensus could be forced. So, there were opposing opinions that were made in the Constituent Assembly. So, these had to be tackled. These had to be brought into a common opinion. So, all these were the challenges. Okay. Now, the problem with separate electorates. So, this can be a question in UPSC. So, these points, the points that we are going to discuss now, can be added in your mains answers. Okay, on 27th August 1947, B. Pokheta Bahadur from Madras made a powerful plea for continuing separate electorates. Minorities exist in all lands, argued Bahadur. They could not be wished away, they could not be erased out of existence. The need was to create a political framework in which minorities could live in harmony with others and the differences between the communities could be minimized. This was possible only if minorities were well represented within the political system, their voices heard, and their views taken into account. Only separate electorates would ensure that Muslims had a meaningful voice in the governance of the country. The need of Muslims, Bahadur felt, could not be properly understood by non Muslims. So, the minorities, their need, their opinions, their demands were often different from that of the majority members. So, that needed to be addressed. Nor would a true representative of Muslims would be chosen by people who did not belong to that community. So, only Muslims could understand their problems. So, how can a non-Muslim select a person, or how a non-Muslim can represent Muslims as a whole? This could not be done. So, this demand for separate electorate provoked anger and dismay among most nationalists. In the passionate debate that followed, a range of arguments were offered against the demand. Most nationalists saw separate electorate as a measure deliberately introduced by the British to divide India. Okay, we have seen parliamentary reforms and all. The English played their game under the cover of safeguards. With the help of it, they allured the minorities to a long lull. Give it up now. Now there is no one to misguide you. So they wanted everyone to be equal. They wanted to everyone to see as Indians. Partitions had made nationalists favorably opposed to the idea of separate electorates. We have given a nation for entire Muslim community, and they are still demanding separate electorates. That's what would have the nationalists would have thought. Okay, they were haunted by the fear of continued civil war, riots, and violence. Separate electorate was a poison that has entered the body politic of our country, declared Sardar Patel. So this quote can be added. This code can be learned by heart. This code, this is kind of an important code we can add in our mains answer writing. Okay, it was a demand that had turned one community against another, divided the nation, caused bloodshed, and led to the tragic partition of the country. So why was this? Because when a separate electorate was there, only the communities of and the representative is going for election campaigns or representing the people. These people often only relate their problems with their own community, so they may talk ill about other communities. So this kind of create a divide in the population. So this was a problem with the separate electorates. Okay, so now we will look at how the Constituent Assembly tackled this problem. So, Govind Balapant, he said, agreed with Bahadur that the success of democracy was to be judged by the confidence it generated among different sections of the people. He agreed too that every citizen was free in a free state should be treated in a manner that satisfied not only his material wants but also his spiritual sense of self-respect, and that the majority community had an obligation to try and understand the problems of the minorities and emphasis with their aspirations. Yet Pant opposed the idea of separate electorates. It was a suicidal demand. So, because we have already seen the negative aspect of separate electorates, he argued that would permanently isolate the minorities, make them vulnerable, and deprive them of any effective say within the government. Okay, that was the argument by Pant. Behind all this argument, there was concerns with making the unified nation state. In order to build political unity and forge nation, every individual had to be molded as a citizen of state. Okay, the sense of nationalism should be within the people rather than religious belief or religious viewpoints. Okay, had to be assimilated within the nation. Okay, and Pant also added, let us remember that it is a citizen that must count. It is the citizen that forms a base as well as a summit of the social pyramid. Even as the importance of community rights are being recognized, there was a lurking fear among many nationalists that this may lead to divided loyalties. So, some people could be divided if you are coming from a Muslim area, if you are coming from a Christian area, and there is a particular leader who most of the community members recognize. At some point they can say we are going away from the nation, we are a separate country. That can be said, okay, if they have the power. So that kind of sense of fear was there in the nationalist. Okay, and not all Muslims supported the demand for separate electorates. Begum Anais Rasool, for instance, felt that the separate electorates were self-destructive since they isolated the minorities from the majority. By 1949, most Muslim members of the Constituent Assembly were agreed that separate electorates were against the interest of the minorities. Instead, Muslims needed to take an active part in the democratic process to ensure that they had a decisive voice in the political system. Okay, now we need something more than resolution. Okay, while welcoming the objective resolution, N.G. Ranga, a socialist who had been a leader of the peasant movement, urged that the term minorities be interpreted in economic terms. Now we are finding the definition of minorities. Okay, the real minorities of for Ranga were the poor and the downtrodden. He welcomed the legal rights of the constitution was granting to each individual but pointed to its limits. In his opinion, it was meaningless for the poor people in the villages to know that they now had the fundamental right to live and to have full employment, or that they could have their meetings, their conferences, their associations, and various other civil liberties. It was essential to create conditions where these constitutionally enshrined rights could be effectively enjoyed. So, the facility needed to be created for these people to go upward in the societal ladder. Okay, that needed to be done. Ranga also drew attention to the gulf that separated the broad masses of Indians and those claiming to speak on their behalf in the Constituent Assembly. So they were, this is another aspect of the gap between the common people and the Constituent Assembly. Whom are we supposed to represent? The ordinary masses of our country. And yet, most of us do not belong to the masses themselves. We are of them. We wish to stand for them. But the masses themselves are not able to come up to the Constituent Assembly. It may take some time. In the meantime, we are here as their trustees, as their champions, and we are trying our best to speak for them. Okay. And there is another one of the groups mentioned by Ranga, the tribals. Okay. Had among its representatives in the assembly the gifted orator Jaipal Singh. In welcoming the objective resolution, Singh said, "This is also another perspective in the view of the tribal community. As an Adivasi, I am not expected to understand the legal intricacies of the resolution. But my common sense tells me that every one of us should march in the road to freedom and fight together. Sir, if there is any group in Indian people that have been shabbily treated, that ill treated, they have been ill treated, it is my people. They have been disgracefully treated, neglected for the last 6,000 years. The whole history of my people is of one continuous exploitation and dispossession of the non-aboriginals of India, punctuated by rebellions and disorder. And yet I take Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru at his word. I take you all at your word that now we are going to start a new chapter of independent India where there is equality of opportunity, where no one would be neglected." So that was what the representatives of the tribal community told the Constituent Assembly. So after tribals, now we have other caste, the depressed class. All these people were there. So how were the rights of the depressed caste to be defined in the constitution? During the national movement, Ambedkar had demanded separate electorates for the depressed class, and Mahatma Gandhi had opposed it. Why? Urging that it would permanently segregate them from the rest of the society. There will be a division. Some members of the depressed caste emphasized that the problem of the untouchables could not be resolved through protection and safeguards alone. Their disabilities were caused by the social norms and the moral values of the caste society. Okay, this was a part of the caste system. Society had used their services and labor but kept them at a social distance, refusing to mix with them or dine with them or allow them entry into temples. "We have been suffering, but we are prepared to suffer no more," said N.G. Nagappa from Madras. "We have realized our responsibilities. We now have to assert ourselves." Nagappa pointed out that though numerically the depressed caste are not a minority, they formed between about 20 to 25% of the total population. Their suffering was due to the systematic marginalization, not that numerical insignificance. They were huge in number, but the caste system was prevailing in the Indian society, untouchability was prevailing in our society. So all these things created a margin, a gap between the common people and the depressed class people. Okay, they had no access to education, no share in the administration. Addressing the assembly, K.G. Khanderkar of the central provinces said, We were suppressed for thousands of years. Suppressed to such an extent that neither our minds nor our bodies and now even our hearts work, nor are we able to march forward. This is the position. So you can see how much hope, how much expectations these people had in the Constituent Assembly. Okay, the tribals, the minorities, all these people had a huge expectation on the Constituent Assembly. So now what were the changes that were brought down by Constituent Assembly? By changes that we can say recommendations. Okay, it recommended untouchability be abolished. Hindu temples were thrown open to all castes, and seats in legislatures and jobs in government offices to be reserved for the lowest caste. Many recognized that this could not solve all problems. Social discrimination could not be erased only through constitutional legislation. There had to be change in the attitudes within the society, but the measures were welcomed by the democratic public. Okay, it was written down, it was said it was made a law that untouchability is not there. All these things were done. Okay. Now we are coming to how the Federation of India was found, or a federal aspect of India is seen. Okay. The draft constitution provided for three lists of subjects: union, state, and concurrent. The subjects in the first list were to be the preserve of the central government, while those in the second list were vested to the states, and on the third list were center and state shared responsibility. However, many items were placed under exclusive union control than on the other federations, and more placed on the concurrent list too than decided by the provinces. So, more power was given to the union government. Okay, so when the British actually, uh, what the ideology of British was that they wanted a loose central government with, I have discussed about three sections: section A, section B, and section C. Okay, all this under a loose central government with autonomous regions which will be governed. They never had an idea of a strong center. That aspect was left out by the British. Okay, so now we will look at why this strong central government opinion was raised in the Constituent Assembly. Okay, as for the states, Santanam felt that the proposed allocation of powers would cripple them. The fiscal provisions would impoverish the provinces since most taxes except land revenue had been made the preserve of center. So Santanam's opinion was that the states would die out soon and strength will be focused on the central government. Okay, so without finances, how could the state undertake any project of development? I did not want any constitution in which the unit has to come to the center and say, I cannot educate my people, I cannot give sanitization, give me a dole for the improvement of roads and industries. Let us rather wipe out the federal system and let us have a unitary system. So, unitary system is coming to place. Sandhana predicted a dark future of the proposed distribution of powers was adopted without further scrutiny. In a few years, he said, all provinces would rise in revolt against the center. So, what we want today is a strong government. So, Ambedkar had declared that he wanted a strong and united center, and much stronger than the center we had created under the Government India Act 1935. I have told you how it was. Okay, reminding the members of the riots and the violence had been ripping the nation apart. Many members had repeatedly stated that the powers of the center had to be greatly strengthened to enable it to stop the communal frenzy. Reacting to the demands of the giving power to the provinces, Gopalaswamy Iyengar declared that the center should be made as strong as possible. So these were the reasons why a strong center recommendation was done. So now we will look at the national language, the language policy adopted by the Constitutional Assembly. Okay. So in the 1930s, the Congress had accepted. I will go through this very fast. So just to understand it, because we will be discussing it in the Lakshmikant polity sessions also. So just to understand it, the Congress had earlier in 1930s accepted Hindustani as the national language because it had a combination or the blend of Hindi and Urdu. Was a popular language in the larger section of the people. We can say Hindi was used by Hindus largely, being having Sanskrit roots, and Urdu having Persian roots, which was used by Muslims as a whole on a large scale. Okay, and Hindustani, which combined both of these languages, should be adopted by as a national language. It was the proposal given by the Congress in 1930s. Okay, but there was a plea for Hindi. Okay, and most of the North Indian congressmen, they demanded that Hindi had to be taken as a national language. But at that time, we can see Hindustani, which had the combination of Persian aspect and the Indian aspect, slowly tilting away from the Persian aspect, and Hindi. In Hindi, lot of the Urdu words were removed and Sanskrit words were taken in. Okay, Hindi was more Sanskritized, and Urdu, on the other hand, was becoming more Persian. So there was a divide between languages, which in turn resulted in a divide between religions. Okay, so and we can see most of the southern states opposed this idea, and most of the Congress leaders in the southern part of India, they even went around talking to people about the adoption of Hindustani rather than Hindi before. Okay, once they came back, they came to know that the plea was for putting Hindi as a national language. So they said there was a huge opposition, especially in the Tamil Nadu region, against Hindi being the national language. Okay, so even though they tried their level best to get Hindi as a national language, there was a huge opposition. Okay, although they were willing to take Hindustani with respect to Hindi, but this was not acceptable. So finally, what we see in the future was that lot of commissions were held, and all these aspects were ultimately based on language, national identity. Hindi and English were taken in as official languages used for official purposes. Okay, so all these things are discussed in this chapter. You can go through or read through this chapter, although I'm just giving crisp of the chapter. That will be better. Okay, so I hope you guys were able to follow today's lecture. So I'll come next time with another chapter. Until then, God bless you all. Jai Hind.